Hi listener, this is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ego and ideological doctrine in favor of meaning, purpose and unity as a whole. So I'm doing another reading of Decoding Schopenhauer's Metaphysics by Bernardo Kastrup. And we're on to chapter 12 now. So the last episode, we pulled together what we've been covering. We pulled together what we've covered so far and into an overarching conceptual framework, or at least Bernardo Kastrup did. I read it, and we were dealing with the implications of that. The portrayal of things is kind of looking at, effectively, like looking at each consciousness, each soul, each being as an alter, in a sense of dissociative identity disorder, like the universe or reality itself as a whole, or the conscious will as a whole, has this association at each soul being a splinter or a fragment or an alter of that overall disassociated consciousness. And the idea is that there's a circle around the edge, kind of like an Ouroboros, and that is all that is source as a whole, let's say, and in Schopenhauer's terms, that's the will, and that's everything. Within that, there's the will at large, which is let's say, the holographic reality, the holographic universe, the simulation that is molded by the mirror principle, the law, and the law of attraction and manifestation. Now, the observation in quantum terms, the observation of the will at large, which is experiential states in superposition. So space-time and so forth. What we experience as the quote objective universe, that is the will at large. It's kind of like an extension of the will in general. But at least according to this formulation, it's everything that isn't an alter that is still part of the overall will. And this is something that's molded by conscious observers, conscious I am observers, right? So basically me, you, even animals and plants. But there is, of course, a difference in how that process works. With plants, for example, it's just basic stimuli response. And that kind of evolves and gets more layers with different, as consciousness over time. So compared to, so for example, with animals, it's perceptual representations, not merely stimuli. And with humans, there's re-representation that's perceptual, representation that's abstract, and abstract re-representations of abstract re-representations. Now, this might not, I don't know for sure if it's definitely how it is, but it definitely tells us certain things. And as for what it'll be like once we've ascended, I don't know. We'll see. So that's the framework that we covered in the last episode. As for what we've covered in the previous episodes before that, well, honestly, I gave a summary of that in the beginning of the last episode, but basically the will is its consciousness, and the representation is kind of, I've previously portrayed that as the simulated reality. So in a sense, the will at large is like the representation of the will as a whole, whereas each alter, let's say, has its own re-representation, perceptual and abstract re-representation of reality. And maybe the will at large is perceptual, is basically the re-representations and the re-representations of re-representations of the will, perhaps, to put it in Schopenhauerian terms. And of course, there's a quantum aspect of this in terms of how everything's connected, unified in a quantum sense, which is very much what we discussed in the last episode as well. So that more or less summarizes what the last 6 episodes that we've done here, or the last 11 chapters. So without further ado, let's carry on. Tackling objections to Schopenhauer's metaphysics. I maintain that God is the immanent cause, as the phrase is, of all things, and not the transitive cause. All things, I say, are in God and move in God. However, as to the view of certain people, that my book, the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, rests on the identification of God with nature, by the latter of which they understand a kind of mass or corporeal matter, they are quite mistaken. Baruch Spinoza, attempting to dispel in letter to Henry Oldenburg, written near the end of 1675, a misinterpretation of his metaphysics that bafflingly persists to this day. Having schematically laid out the overall structure of Schopenhauer's metaphysics, we are now well equipped to clarify what I believe to be some prominent misinterpretations of it. Janaway argues that because Schopenhauer characterizes the will as blind striving devoid of deliberate purpose, it unfolds at a level beneath that of conscious thought. He also claims that Schopenhauer clearly does not think that organisms entertain any conscious purposes, for the will works blindly. The confusion here, a common one, as we've seen in chapter 5, is mistaking metaconsciousness for consciousness proper. This is forgivable insofar as even Schopenhauer conflates the terms. Nonetheless, allow me to reiterate, whereas metaconsciousness is indeed required for deliberate choices, the sort we experience when we plan a trip or choose a mortgage package, conscious volition can be experienced in an immediate manner, without re-representation, such as when we choose our left or right foot to take our first step in the morning. A very illustrative example is our will to breathe, for it can be experienced both metaconsciously and merely consciously. For instance, up until this moment, you have been consciously experiencing your will to breathe, but without being aware that you want to breathe. The will to breathe is ordinarily autonomous. Schopenhauer would call it immediate, necessary, and certain, unfolding without re-representation. However, the moment your attention is redirected appropriately, you re-represent it. You realize that you want to breathe. At this point, you can deliberately hold your breath. So whatever volition takes place, with or without re-representation, it can be conscious, i.e. entail qualia, what is its likeness, what it is likeness in either case. Yeah, to clarify, a qualia is what it is likeness. So it's kind of like the way something feels or the vibe of something, a characteristic of something that's not like blue is a qualia, right? Technically, you could say that blue is more like a wavelength, but in terms of how it's experienced, it's blue. And that experience is a qualia. In its raw primordial configuration, the will is clearly not metaconscious. As such, it entails blind striving, but only insofar as our own will to breathe is also ordinarily a form of blind striving. It unfolds the way it does as a consequence of how we function, not as a result of deliberation. Just as our will to breathe isn't actually unconscious, so the raw will isn't unconscious either. The blind striving described by Schopenhauer excludes metaconsciousness, not consciousness proper. It's an interesting distinction here. I don't know how, I'm not sure how relevant it is per se, but I feel like talking about it, where on one hand, you can be just unconsciously breathing. And often this can be shallow breathing, which isn't necessarily the best for you. Or you can take active control of your breathing. In fact, you could even go out of your way to have really deep breathing. And often people might do that in meditation. But perhaps, and this is something Alan Watts mentioned, addressed, is that what you can do is view your breathing like, often we view your breathing like it sort of flows out of us when we breathe out. Like we suck it in and it flows out of us, suck it in, flows out of us. But one way of looking at it, he says, is the other way around, where you sort of wait until it naturally flows in, and while observing it, and breathe it out naturally. And then you can kind of breathe it in and out in a way which is natural, but while observing it. Because normally you have your natural breathing and you're just not observing it, right? But you can be conscious of what you're not actively directing. So it's not, it's like it's not conscious, or I suppose it's you could say maybe metaconscious, but it's a sort of, you're aware of your breathing, but you're not, I suppose it's maybe intuitive breathing. I hope that was relevant anyway. So, right, so where did we get to the that paragraph there? Just as our will to breathe isn't actually unconscious, so the raw will isn't unconscious either. The blind striving described by Schopenhauer excludes metaconsciousness, not consciousness proper. Although our will to breathe can be experienced both metaconsciously and merely consciously, the volition driving most of our autonomous biological functions, think of the beating of the heart, the activity of the glands, and the bodily metabolism in general, unfolds virtually always below the reach of introspection, except perhaps for some elusive, prodigious meditator somewhere in the Himalayas. The rest of us mortals can't experience it metaconsciously. Yet it too, according to my interpretation of Schopenhauer's metaphysics, is conscious. And I would say that aligns with what I was just saying. Janaway makes a meal of Schopenhauer's warning that we must extend our understanding of the will beyond ordinary human volition, so to grasp its manifestation in nature at large. Bewilderingly, he implies that Schopenhauer doesn't clarify what this extension entails, and therefore this door is supposedly left open to other interpretations of the will, besides conscious volition. Yet Schopenhauer, in fact, immediately and comprehensively clarifies what he means. In humans, the will is guided by knowledge, strictly according to motives, indeed only to abstract motives, this manifesting itself under the guidance of reason. In other words, human beings ordinarily experience the will as deliberate, introspectively accessible, metaconscious volitional states. However, the will is also active where it is not guided by any knowledge, for representation as motive is not a necessary and essential condition for the will's activity. So the will in nature at large does not need to be accompanied by self-reflection, i.e. knowledge or motive, in Schopenhauer's terminology, as it ordinarily is in our case. Outside the field of our self-reflection of human beings and higher animals, it still consists of conscious volitional states, but no reflections or re-representations thereof. This is the acquired extension of understanding of the will beyond how we ordinarily experience our own volition. And because of it, if I say that the force which attracts a stone to the earth is will, then no one will attach to this proposition the absurd meaning that the stone moves itself according to a known motive, merely because it is, merely is something added in by the author here, so according to a known motive, because it is thus that the will appears in man. So no one will attach to this proposition the absurd meaning that the stone moves itself according to a known motive, because it is thus that the will appears in man. And I would say, even according to like the a law of one formulation of things, like I mean that's first density. Like that's even less than responding to stimuli. There's not that. It's just basic being, an observation of being, I suppose, rather than even response to stimuli. How could Schopenhauer be clearer? To understand the will at large, we must abstract self-reflection away from our conscious volition. In the inorganic world, the will is to be regarded as blind, though still consciously felt, impulses or instincts. That's it. Schopenhauer is merely warning us not to limit our conception of the will to the higher levels of metaconsciousness, at which we experience our own desires and fears. In the scheme of Figure 1, the point is that in human consciousness, our conceptual knowledge of feelings eclipses our immediate experience of endogenous feelings, but in weaker, less distinct phenomena of nature, the latter either dominates or constitutes a sole mode of acquaintance with the will. That Janaway seems to have missed Schopenhauer's extensive elaboration on this point is odd, perhaps even deliberate, but that's just a suggestion. Regarding Schopenhauer's account of the process of perception and its mediation by the bodily senses, Janaway offers the following objection. According to Schopenhauer, we apprehend some bodily state. The intellect then projects as cause of the sensation a material object outside in space, but this is troubling. For one thing, where do bodily sensations come from? They must surely be originally caused in the body by something prior to the operation of the intellect. But Schopenhauer does not discuss what this prior cause may be. Of course he doesn't, for there cannot be any cause prior to the intellect. We must ponder the question from within Schopenhauer's own logic and terms. The material body is just representation, and so is causation. When he speaks of perception as being caused by a change in our bodily state, he is merely describing the process of perception from the perspective of its re-representation. In other words, he is describing how the process in itself, so to speak, presents itself in our intellect. But the process in itself is not material. It is not re-representation. It entails no physical body. Instead, it consists of the mutual impingement of experiential states across a dissociative boundary, as described in the previous chapter with reference to Figure 3. Now, I recall a big gripe I had for a long time when I was an atheist with, as I saw it, solipsism. I also associated it with post-structuralism as well, and postmodernism, but also I guess mysticism as well. My issue with it was that if everything is relative and subjective, right, then if there's no objective reference point, then what is like if there's nothing before the mind, what's the context of the existence of the mind in the first place? Because the idea is that there has to be a physical basis for the existence of consciousness for there to even be a perspective in the first place. And if you're just saying everything is subjective, there's nothing real that it starts from, or at least that's what I've thought about. And I think other people might have had such an objection before. And it's very much understandable, especially in this atheistic age we grew up in, or the secular age anyway. So the reason why it actually does make sense for there to be the mind being the first thing is actually what I just read out. So, I mean, originally always one conscious mind just in existence, and a field of energy, and that energy is conscious. Now, it's basically conscious energy. Now, if you're aware with New Age mysticism and the law of one and energy and frequency and vibration, and these are things that Tesla talked about. If you're aware that even when you look at the brain, like there's different waves, there's alpha waves, beta waves, theta waves, etc. And even on a measurement level, consciousness is, even on a mainstream level, consciousness on some level interpreted in terms of activity in the brain, right? So, and that activity is energetic and fundamentally involves energy, and energy comes in the form of frequency, waves, and fields, right? And so even by the mainstream perspective, surely consciousness is actually energy, which means if everything originates from an original source field frequency, which it does according to law of one, then it would make sense that, yeah, like the origin of all things is a frequency in a sense, or at least it's an energy, you know? It's an energy field that encompasses everything. That circle around everything, that circle that's what it is. It's all that is, and it's an energetic field, a conscious energetic field. And all souls are just, well, I won't say just, but all souls are in a sense alters of a dissociative unitive conscious energy field. And there are many fields within it, but it's the all-encompassing field. And everything was created by it. And so from this perspective, it is certain, it's at least logically consistent that the mind came first, in the sense that, and it's in line with this, which is that intellect is how it's, what was it? It was described by the author. Tell you what, I'll read it again just to clarify. Of course he doesn't, for there cannot be any such cause prior to the intellect. We must ponder the question from within Schopenhauer's own logic and terms. The material body is just re-representation, and so is causation. When he speaks of perception as being caused by a change in our bodily state, he is merely describing the process of perception from the perspective of its re-representation. In other words, he is describing how the process in itself, so to speak, presents itself in our intellect. But the process in itself is not material. It is re-representation. It entails no physical body. Instead, it consists of the mutual impingement of experiential states across a dissociative boundary, as described in the previous chapter with reference to figure 3. So, yeah, I'll continue then. Contrary to what Janaway seems to suggest in the passage quoted above, it makes no sense to look for a causal explanation for the process in itself, for we cannot reduce the process in itself to re-representation. In fact, I think what we're coming to here is actually kind of like, it kind of relates to the cosmological argument in a way. And I used to scoff at that. But, I mean, there has to be an original cause, right? That's necessary and not contingent upon anything else. Something that would basically be eternal and transcend time and space, basically, and be something which everything is, something unitive. It's something that, I suppose, the conscious, all that is source field would be that, and that source, or, you know, God, I guess you could call it. You know, there's other words for it. Attempting to do so inverts the logic of Schopenhauer's metaphysics. To understand perception as it is in itself, we must think in terms not of physical causation, but of the experiential dynamics of the will, as illustrated in figure 3. These dynamics are then presented to us in the form of physical things, e.g. photons, air pressure oscillations, drifting scent molecules, etc., interacting with our skin and other sense organs in space-time, which we then translate into a causal explanation by means of abstract reasoning. The re-representation of the process of perception in terms of particles, forces, and causal action exists only in our respective physical world. See figure 3 again, as an image and appearance of the actual non-physical process of mutual impingement of experiential states. I also add that, of course, there is actual evidence for this conscious energy in consciousness as energy. I mean, brainwaves are an example of that. But of course, I'm sure there's much more to it than that. I mean, I've dealt with that in other stuff about quantum physics, the other readings, the book by Henry Stapp. But yeah, I'm aware that some people might not be sure what that means, the mutual impingement of experiential states. It's to do with that disassociation thing where it's basically that impingement is when, so if the holographic part of reality, which is described in this as the will at large, is affected by observation upon it, and it's of which each observer, there's a superposition, and all the observers interacting affect like what manifests, but there's also different timelines, but let's not get into that right now. And basically, it's the impingement of what's manifested upon your consciousness. It comes in, this is my interpretation anyway, I might be wrong, but it's, yeah, it's that consciousness coming into you becoming aware of things in a sense external to you. It's only external to you in the sense that consciousness is disassociated. On a conscious level, in terms of consciousness or awareness, it's external, but in truth, it's all unified. And that impingement is it just coming into your awareness and being experienced. So that's what it says. But other people have that too. All the alters, let's say, have that, all the souls of that. And that's what it means by non-physical process of mutual impingement of experiential states. Just as it's mutual co-creation, it's also co-experience. think of it like a play where, okay, there's a bunch of actors, and of course they're all co-creating the play, right? But they're also experiencing it because they're also the audience. Because I suppose it's like the play that people do for each other. And they decide, instead of doing it for an audience out external to them, they're doing it so that they observe it from their perspective as they're doing the play, which makes it more immersive. It's like, hey, let's do this really super immersive play where there won't be an audience out there. We'll all be doing it, but we'll only see it from our perspective. And if we get really into the roles, we might not even be aware that we're doing it until afterwards. Wouldn't that be fun, right? And that's what we've been doing for a long time. And then you finish, but you're like, oh, there's stuff we didn't deal with, there's stuff I haven't dealt with, you know. And maybe you've dealt with karma, just you've invested in like things and so forth. So you keep going back to the play, carry on. Let's do a sequel. Let's carry on the story, the plot, right? And eventually, it's like, well, I mean, it's something you keep coming back to. I think that's a good metaphor for it. I really think the play metaphor works. And originally, it was Aaron Abke who I got that idea from, because it was talking about how the ego identity is like the character, and you're like the actor. I think it fits. So, if we continue to think in terms of the dynamics of the will itself, instead of its appearance on the screen of perception, Janaway's next question should strike us as trivial. Schopenhauer never claims that the will as a thing in itself is a cause. But then, what is the relationship between the world in itself and the things and events that lie within our empirical knowledge? I mean, based on this interpretation by Bernardo Kastrup, I mean, Schopenhauer does claim that the will in itself is a cause. In fact, he claims that it's the cause and the other things aren't, or at least they're secondary causes that are ultimately caused by the will as a whole. And if you think about it, alters are within, or all by alters is both, but alters are within the will. Technically, you could say alters are within the will at large, in a sense. But what is the will? The will is kind of the holistic whole of the experience and manifestation of each of the alters or souls or what have you. So yeah, it's kind of both. Yeah, it is that illustrated in figure 3, the dynamics of experiential states across the two sides of a dissociative boundary create, at the point where they interact with or impinge on one another, the perceived things and events that lie within our empirical knowledge, i.e. our respective physical world. Schopenhauer doesn't consider this experiential impingement causation because he reserves the term for the behavioral nexus of the physical world, which is the representation of the impingement. Pardon me, which is the, oh, pardon me, again, it says, I didn't misread it. It said representation. I thought it was said re-representation. I misread it. Nope, it does say, but if you think about it, what is that? A re-presentation. We start off, the experience is maybe the presentation initially, and then you just represent it to yourself. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. Also, he just clarified something that I kind of missed, was that Schopenhauer, when he used the term causation, he was referring to it just on the physical level. Whereas when it's not on a physical level, he doesn't call it causation. He calls it something else. I think representation. Oh, it says here, but beyond the alters, there are just the superposed experiential states of the will at large, not a physical world, i.e. not causation. Okay, that's, I mean, what even is the physical world? You could argue that it's holographic reality. Say, I mean, you could say, oh, that means it's not real then. But what does real mean? What does illusion mean? Are we going to create are we going to create are we going to, in our abstract representation of this, are we going to create a duality between real and illusion, or real and fake, or true and false? And are we going to say that there's the conscious soul level of things, and then there's the manifested or the created stuff that's just holographic and not real, and that it's all just soul just making shit up that's not real, source, which we all are, just making shit up that's not real, and everything else is fake? Like, I don't see it that way. I think that's dualistic, and I don't think that's unitive. And I think that unity is what it's all about, and that we are all one, and that would fly in the face if we are all one. So I think that to really be non-dualistic, it requires kind of moving beyond the whole duality between true and false. And it's like true, false. Like it doesn't really, on some level, it doesn't really matter. I don't know, it just seems like utterly absurd to like compared to what the conditioned common sense that we have. But if you think about it, or whatever, you know, if it's all just, it's everything is everything within the bounds of all that is, if there's even a limit to that, because it wouldn't really be limited, because if it's limited, it wouldn't be all that is, because it's infinite, the infinite creator. Anything that less than infinity is limitation. So, I mean, if it's like that, that means everything that's, quote, made up is actually real and part of reality. And everything that's, quote, real is it also, in a sense, made up. Now, you could say, okay, but there's also, okay, there is the soul bit or the source bit that is the preceding everything. But that's also part of everything. So the rest is an extension of, if everything's conscious infinity and everything, and then there's the source of conscious infinity and there's the extension of it. The extension of it is still it. It's just an extended part of it. So to say that there's source which is real and then there's everything else that's fake, that not real, that is missing the point. It's not, there isn't the fake. And by the way, I actually think that every single story that's ever been written is an actual world. All the characters are actual souls, actually incarnated, actually living their lives. And if you write a story, it's either already, and it already exists, you didn't create it, it already existed in the Akashic Records. So you don't hold a responsibility for that. So you don't like write this really dark story and then you're like, oh no, well, I created all that tragedy. Like, no. All of it is in the Akashic Records, all the infinite possibilities. So like every story that hasn't been written yet is real and being lived by incarnated souls in the eternal presence. Right, okay, carry on. Janaway argues that Schopenhauer's claim that the experiential states are the inner essence of the world, even the inanimate part of the world, is likely to be dismissed as fanciful, something ridiculous, and even merely embarrassing. He suggests that to salvage Schopenhauer's metaphysics, we have to interpret the term will as a rhetorical metaphor. Whilst acknowledging that the will must still be understood in terms of our privileged access to ourselves, i.e. in terms of what it is like to be us, he claims that we must enlarge its sense that at least, I'll start again. We must enlarge its sense at least far enough to avoid the barbarity of thinking that every process in the world has a mind, a consciousness, or a purpose behind it. Pardon me, I'm being a bit, I'm being a bit of a dick toward them because, okay, that's a judgment. But, you know, I'm being a bit harsh in Janaway, but doing it in that voice, but, you know, it was fun. All right. This is a subjective and rather arbitrary value judgment, as Janaway doesn't argue for or substantiate it. Instead, he seems to be taking the mainstream physicalist common sense according to which consciousness cannot be anything other than an epiphenomenon of material brain function for granted. If so, he is simply begging the question, since the point in contention is precisely one of metaphysics. It is circular reasoning to take a non-trivial metaphysical conclusion for an axiom. Setting aside vulgar beliefs and biases, there is absolutely nothing fanciful, ridiculous, embarrassing, or barbaric about the notion that the inner essence of everything consists of experiential states. This is a coherent postulate integral to a number of ontologies proposed and debated in analytic philosophy today, such as the many variations of panpsychism, cosmopsychism, and idealism. You know, I haven't actually heard of cosmopsychism. Actually, let me write that down. I want to look that up after this. The cosmos as a psyche. I don't know how that's different from panpsychism, but I'll look that up. Yeah. The final objection raised by Janaway reflects the subtlety of an important point. According to Schopenhauer, underlying and grounding each mortal individual subject is the pure subject of knowing. Unitary, universal, and immortal, this pure subject of knowing is what remains over as the eternal world I, after individuality is abolished. Janaway then remarks that Schopenhauer's attitude to this pure subject of re-representation is ambivalent. On the one hand, he says everyone finds himself as this subject. At the same time, however, each of us is an individual distinct from others. And this eternal world I, well, it's source, isn't it? It's the all that is. It's the will in this metaphysics. He has serious grievances about this ambivalence. The problem, bluntly, is this. In my real self, or the kernel of my inner nature, something that attaches to the finite individual that I am, or is the thing in itself beyond space, time, and individuation together, altogether. Schopenhauer seems to stumble into a quite elementary difficulty here. The difficulty, if any, seems to be Janaway's with figuring out what Schopenhauer is saying. That's almost passive-aggressive, that sort of subtle dig there. Fortunately, present-day analytic philosophy, with its knack for eliminating even the most benign and easily reconcilable ambiguities, comes to the rescue. In his attempt to circumvent the subject combination problem of panpsychism, Shani posits that a unitary universal consciousness allocates its myriad experiential states to multiple relative subjects. His hypothesis is, in a general sense, analogous to the idea of will undergoing disassociation into multiple alters. Shani then remarks that all relative subjects inherit the core subjectivity of the universal consciousness by virtue of being segments of the latter, just as alters remain segments of the will. This core subjectivity is the dative of experience, that to whom things are given or disclosed from a perspective. In other words, core subjectivity is what remains of a relative subject when its experiential contents cease. It is pure subjectivity or isness, no, pardon me, or inness, identical across all relative subjects. We can directly transpose this to Schopenhauer's metaphysics. We are all the eternal will in the sense that we, as authors, necessarily inherit the core subjectivity of the will. The dative or recipient of experience underlying each and every individual subject is identical, and identical to that of the will as a whole. The sole fundamental subject, which is thus whole and undivided in every representing being. Now, this is this relates to the law of correspondence and something I've addressed in a previous episode I did, where the whole is at every level, right? You can see a representation, or you can see the whole or reality at every single level of analysis, in a sense. That's the law of correspondence, or as above, so below, as below, so above, which also applies to within and without, or any sense of direction or dimension. It doesn't just apply to up and down. It's symbolic. And what was the other thing? I can't remember. Schopenhauer describes precisely this when he refers to the pure subject of knowledge as that one eye of the world which looks out from all knowing creatures. The pure subject of knowing is a subjectivity behind the eye itself, not what the eye happens to see from the individual perspective of any particular author. Oh, yeah, I remember what it was. Yeah, and that's connected to what Ken Wilber calls holons. So yeah. And a holon is like a whole and a part of a larger whole at the same time. And in the context of the law of correspondence and what we've been dealing with here, it all fits together. I mean, I see everything is like interwoven by like white source threads. Does that make sense? It does to me. That's how I'll picture it. The pure subject of knowing is the subjectivity that yeah, I completely failed there. The subject right. The pure subject of knowing is the subjectivity behind the eye itself, not what the eye happens to see from the individual perspective of any particular author. If you and I were to become completely amnesiac while in an ideal sensory deprivation chamber, for at least a moment, all that would be left in both our inner lives would be this core subjectivity, this inness, identical in both you and me. I mean, the ego would arguably remain, potentially, but I see his point. At the same time, the fact that we are each a different author confers upon each of us a unique, localized, and restricted perspective within the activity of the will, an idiosyncratic point of view or window into the experiential environment surrounding us, which provides each of us with a particular set of contents of perception, and not just this. If you consider that we've had how many lifetimes, or to put it in the play metaphor, how many plays that we've been doing in a sequence, basically, based on the particular set of roles we've done, all the roles we've done, and based on that order and how we experienced it, that's unique to every single one. That's a different fingerprint. But arguably, we started off as different fingerprints of the overall source originally, in that there's a whole that is the, let's say the Actors Guild, for argument's sake, right? And these actors, they are a whole, right? But each individual one represents a different aspect of that whole. Or in another sense, represents a different aspect of source. And that is all that is. And since it's infinite, there's not a limit to how many souls there are in the infinite fractal universe. So, moreover, as authors, we also have particular private endogenous volitional states concomitant with our instinctive desire to survive. In this sense, we are each a differentiated individual subject, mortal by virtue of the inexorable end of our respective dissociative process, constituted by private, idiosyncratic experiential states, dissociated from the rest. Schopenhauer is quite explicit about this double identity, stating, we can attribute to everyone a twofold existence. Consequently, and entirely reasonably, he also uses the word I in two different senses, depending on context. Nonetheless, Janaway still has a problem with it. Schopenhauer has previously told us that I refers to the material, striving human being, which would not exist were it not for his or her bodily organs. But how could anything to which I refers remain if the human being ceased to exist, taking with it the subject's consciousness? I mean, that kind of fundamental misunderstanding. I mean, I've dealt with that before. And it's not something to judge, but it's kind of like, it displays a level of awareness that does not correspond with the content, with the level of awareness required to comprehend the content in question. Given the preceding clarifications, it should be fairly easy to see that the pronoun I is in fact entirely appropriate for referring to both the identities, both of the identities or modes of existence of a human being. When referring to a pure subject of knowledge, I denotes the contentless recipient of experience, immortal and identical across all individual subjects, which remains unimpaired when the individual subject becomes extinct in death. I'll read that without the bit that I was added in, which is remains unimpaired when becomes, or whatever, that doesn't make sense. Remains unimpaired when the individual subject becomes extinct in death. And that's a contentless recipient. That's an experience that is eternal. It's never lost. It's almost like a oneness that we have with the universe that is always there and that we always are. We are under the illusion that we are this other thing. And in a sense, we are while we are. It's an illusion that's true. Keep that in mind about illusion and real, let's say, that there's a dualistic understanding that perhaps gets in the way. And keep in mind the unity between the opposites when we refer to one side of a polarity. And so actually keep that in mind whenever I or anyone else actually refers to one side of a polarity, is that it's part of a polarity. It's a unified polarity. It's not just, it's one part of the whole. It's not just one or the other of an opposite. Indeed, in its mode of existence as a pure subject of knowing, man is nature herself. That's quoting Schopenhauer. And also keep in mind, it's this very issue, this very subjectivity is the very thing that by not appreciating, Janaway seems to be not understanding what he's saying, because I can be used in different contexts and words can be used differently in different contexts. And by looking with that more holistic perspective, by observing a more holistic perspective, in that more mindful way, the context is noticed more, and there's more of that, how to put it, awareness of what's being experienced when it's being read, in a sense. And so the very thing that we're describing is kind of, yeah, it's like, it's kind of proving the point in a sense. Like the point that's being made, that's being misunderstood, is the point that they're missing. Okay, you get what I'm saying, right? I can't think of the exact perfect way to say it, and I don't need to say it in the perfect way, right? So, given the preceding clarifications, it should be fairly easy to see that, oh, wait, I've already said that. On the other hand, when referring to a human being's mode of existence as an author of the will, the pronoun I denotes a particular set of experiential contents given to the universal recipient. I'm wondering, how long is this chapter anyway? Oh, we're almost there, almost there. On the other hand, when referring to a human being's mode of existence as an author of the will, the pronoun I denotes a particular, okay, I probably went into too much tangent for you to actually follow this. Okay. So the first is the eternal aspect of that subjective experience that goes beyond any particular lifetime, and that's a more unitive one. And then there's, on the other hand, when referring to human beings' mode of existence as an author of the will, the pronoun I denotes a particular set of experiential contents given to the universal recipient, the individual desire to survive in its many manifestations, as well as a conceptual mental narrative one identifies one with, basically an identity, both of which are constituted by experiential states circumscribed by the author's respective dissociative boundary. This latter I disappears upon death in a way analogous to how a dream avatar vanishes when we wake up, or how the author of a human DID patient, dissociative identity disorder patient, becomes reintegrated into the host personality upon a cure. Schopenhauer's ambivalence is thus far from an expression of confusion, as Janaway rather daringly claims. Rather, the stature of the philosopher he is referring to, but a sophisticated and nuanced effort to cater to people's various intuitions regarding what is meant by I. And it's fitting, I would add, because he was dealing with that level of, he was talking about subjective experience. The very concept he was dealing with is what he was applying in how he was using I. And the very thing that isn't being grasped by Janaway. And because it's not being grasped, the fact that I is being used in the way is being missed. And that's not something to judge Janaway for. It's just a reflection of Janaway's perspective, really. And maybe I have sounded judgmental of Janaway. Maybe I have judged Janaway as I was reading this. And you might have heard that in my tone or whatever. And, I can forgive myself for that. I'm not, I'm on my journey of from ideology to unity, right? Just as we all are. So, well, we have reached the end of the chapter. To give you a tease of the next episode, it's Platonic Ideas and Excitations of the Will. So this is pretty interesting, what we read here. So I quite enjoyed myself. I quite enjoyed I kind of enjoyed ripping into Janaway, to be honest. I know it's not really fair, but it's it was enjoyable, and also, you know, really exploring further the Schopenhauer's metaphysics and dealing with clarifications, and bringing some other things into it as well. Yeah, I always enjoy doing that. So hopefully you enjoyed it too. And if you didn't, I don't know why you're still listening. Yeah, have a great day, I guess, or evening, or whatever. And if you're not having a great day, you know, that's okay too. It's all part of the ups and downs of life. So when I say have a great day, I don't mean to like spiritually bypass, though. Like, so anyway, without further ado, bye for now.